It is my pleasure to introduce Matt Dallek, who is a member of Temple Micah, and his newest book, Birchers. I see I have an echo. Birchers Antisemitism and the Rise of the Far Right. And you could probably see that there are a few copies of the book here. So if any of you are interested in purchasing it, that would be great. So Matt is an historian and professor of political management at George Washington University. And his research and teaching interests include 20th century U.S. politics, political extremism and violence, and the ebb and flow of the far right in modern America. So please join me in welcoming Matt to Lunch and Learn for what I assume will be a great talk and bring back the memories of when we all were talking about the John Birch Society. Yeah, right.
Thank you, Roberta, and thank you to Temple Micah for, oh, sorry. Hold on here. Oh, thank you. Yeah, I can also hold it, Yeah. Okay. Yeah. No, how's this? Better? Okay. I also talk loud, so yes, I'm a loud talker. Thanks for having me. I was just going to start by saying that about a year ago, actually, during the Micah annual literary, I think it's a literary festival, I did an event here with my good friend Philippa Strum, who talked to you all last month. And it was the only time where we, maybe one of the few times in history where we had a conversation about the John Birch Society and Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And it was the only other time that I've ever seen the Birchers and Ruth Bader Ginsburg kind of mentioned in a similar sort of vein, or one place was in the TV show Miss America about Phyllis Schlafly and the second wave of feminism. Anyways, I had actually the showrunner of Miss America, basically the writer, the woman who, Mrs. America, who directed it, and it was her brainchild. And I told her, I said, the only other time I've ever seen RBG and the Birchers together was in your show. And when Flip and I told Flip that she was a tough act to follow, but I'm really happy to be here. And I know the Birchers are not Ruth Bader Ginsburg, but it'll hopefully be interesting. So I'll just talk for 20 to 30 minutes about the Birch Society, but also talk a little bit about the rise of, or the relationship to anti-Semitism, and the evolution of the far right, and then we can, have a conversation. And again, if you can't hear me at any point, just let me know. So I'll start by saying that in 1962, Patricia Hitt, who was an ally of Richard Nixon, ran for a seat on the Republican Party county committee in California. And members of the John Birch Society, and it sounds like many of you know about the group, right? But a far-right organization that believed really that communists controlled America's institutions, they unloaded on her. This is in Southern California. Letters, many using the same stock phrases, started arriving at her home. The tone was nasty. Considerable hate, she said, was raining down on her and her family. And worse still was the phone harassment. At all hours, Hitt received calls from anonymous speakers with the same message: "You'll rue this day." When she and her husband switched to an unlisted number, the Birchers started calling Republicans in her district, denouncing her as, quote, a communist, a socialist, and a pinko. Birchers, she later reflected, and remember, this is an ally of Nixon, she later reflected, were, quote, wild, haters beyond anything I've ever seen in my life, and an enormously destructive force. She lost that campaign, but when she recalled this episode in the mid-1970s, the extremists had receded as a force within her party. Mainstream sensibilities had seemingly prevailed. And Hick concluded that the mainstream right would continue to dominate the GOP for the foreseeable future. And for a long time, I argue in my book, Birchers, her prediction turned out to be correct. But in recent years, and this sort of gives you a sense of, I guess, how I got interested in this project, especially with the ascent of Donald Trump to leadership of the American right, what it means to be a conservative or a member of the Republican Party has changed. And one argument I make is that the newly dominant political ideas and attitudes bear the imprint of the John Birch Society. I argue that the extremist takeover of the American right required more than 6 decades, and that the process was halting and contingent, right? It was not by any stretch inevitable or foreordained. And that, in fact, for a while, the Birch Society receded from influence. But over time, its ideas solidified their place in the conservative coalition, and eventually, around the second decade of the 21st century, enjoyed a revival. And so then the question, of course, is how did this happen? Well, the political right in the US, I think, has always encompassed a variety of factions. You have Chamber of Commerce conservatives, Wall Street conservatives, libertarians. Sorry, I'm just going to actually hold this so I can. Is there a way to? Got it. All right. So you have Chamber of Commerce conservatives, Wall Street conservatives, libertarians, fundamentalist Christians, those reconciled to the New Deal, and those bent on repealing it. And historians, I think, have typically distinguished between the more moderate Republicans, like Dwight Eisenhower, who dominated the party for years, and the more ideological movement conservatives, who first burst on the scene with Barry Goldwater in the early 1960s, and then more enduringly with Ronald Reagan's election as president in 1980. But I argue that another dividing line also existed within the conservative coalition, with all the mainstream electorally successful figures from Eisenhower to Reagan on one side, and a more extreme ultra-conservative faction on the other. Many issues separated the fringe from the mainstream right, but I think major distinctions centered on explicit racism, anti-interventionism versus internationalism, conspiracy theories, and a more apocalyptic, violent, anti-establishment mode of politics. And actually, about a year ago, a couple months after my book came out, someone told me that Steve Bannon was holding up a copy of my book on the War Room, his podcast and TV show. And I was, obviously scared. I'm like, why would Bannon be holding up a book? I thought he it said something horrible. But anyway, he held up the book and he said, this book is MAGA hating, patriot hating, Donald Trump hating, but it's an incredible book. He said, I really like this book. And ever since I've had this, I've never talked to him, of course. But I'm like, well, why did it resonate with him? And I think there are a few reasons, but I think one reason is because he recognized kind of himself and his movement in the Birchers as sort of this anti-establishment, more violent project, and as really hating the Republican establishment or the mainstream conservatives who he felt sold them out time and time again. And what I argue is that while the mainstream and fringe wings of conservatism aligned on discrete issues and in particular moments, the Birch Society and the mainstream right also had sharp differences of opinion that pulled them in opposing directions. That for years, the two were more antagonists than partners, each side working to check the other, sometimes seeing each other as an enemy within. And for Bannon, I think that also probably rings true, right? Where he sees someone like a Mitch McConnell as maybe a greater enemy than Hakeem Jeffries at times, the person that he's most got to take out. In a nutshell, I argue that the Birchers helped radicalize the right because they bequeathed a usable past and forged an alternative political tradition on the far right. And because GOP mandarins accommodated the Birchers and their successors wooed them for money and votes, and gave them a political home. So let me just briefly talk a little about the Birchers. A small band of anti-New Deal businessmen established a society in 1958. I'm just curious, like, how many of you remember hearing the Birchers? Yeah, so most of you, yeah. So this is, the Birchers still, the movement still has legs, right? It's still very much, people of all, even, people remember it. So Robert Welch, the founder, and the others, they were rich, white, and almost uniformly Christian. There were 12 founders. And they combined, what's interesting about them is that they combined mainstream associations with beliefs that at the time were widely seen as fringe. So 3 of the founders had served as president of the National Association of Manufacturers, right? A prominent industrial lobbying group. One of the men was named Milwaukee Sentinel's Man of the Year in 1953 and led the YMCA. At the same time, though, their views occupied a spot on the edge of the political spectrum. They regarded the growth of government in the first half of the 20th century, U.S. participation in World Wars I and II, and the unrelenting expansion of welfare programs as steps toward living under communist rule. So despite, and this is, again, what I found to be one of the more interesting puzzles of the project, which is that despite their wealth and status as colossi bestriding the world's most dynamic economy, because they were incredibly wealthy and actually quite powerful in their own right, but they also shared a rage at what they considered a string of failures and deceptions that had brought the United States to its knees. They had a simple sounding goal. Their plan was to teach the masses, to educate the masses about the internal communist threat to the United States. By the mid-1960s, the group had recruited some 60,000 to 100,000. So it was large-ish, but at a population of 160 million people, roughly in the 1960s, it was not like, it didn't even come close to a million. Most of these members upwardly mobile, white, Christian, often suburban men and women who joined local 20-person chapters in their communities, right? They had a rule, once a chapter hit 20, they had to, if there was more demand, they had to form a new chapter. We can talk about why that was. Birchers held many beliefs. I'm just going to sum up a few of them. So they rejected virtually the entire post-World War II U.S.-led international order, urged the United States to get out of the United Nations. I don't know if anyone's seen the bumper stickers, U.S. out of the UN. They warned of the greatest threat to the U.S. political, media, and other elites. One Birch leader told a rally in 1974 that the nation's establishment had imposed, quote, planned shortages of consumer goods on the country and had to be brought to justice. Quote, we're going to take Nixon and Kissinger, McGovern, Fulbright, politicians of that sort, and we're going to try them for treason, and they'll be hanged, he said. Newsmen, take that message and publicize it. The message they'll get is the Americans are coming. And about 400 Birchers, this is in Colorado, about 400 Birchers, according to the news report, gave this spokesperson a standing ovation. Now, one question is, were they, this was a question at the time, and I think it's been a question that has endured, which is, were they anti-Semitic? Were they racist? Right? Was that part of their constellation of beliefs? So Birchers argued, actually quite vociferously, they argued that they welcomed Americans of all faiths, right? All colors, all creeds. And they also pointed to the existence of a handful of African-American and Jewish members. And it's true, right, that there were some Jewish and African-American Birchers. Also, the society maintained that they did not allow people from the KKK, for example, into their ranks. They said actually that the only grounds for the denial of membership was that if you were a secular, if you had no religious faith. At least that was their, again, their what they told people, right? Although I didn't find any examples of them rejecting a non-believer. But what I argue in the book, and I think what I document, I try to do it fairly extensively, is that the Birchers ultimately drew energy from bigots. At times, they promoted racist and anti-Semitic stereotypes. So member Ingrid Cowan reported that in her state, Mississippi, quote, the KKK is such a strong competitor to the society, at least when it comes to recruiting members. A guy named Ravillo Oliver, who is one of the 12 founders, also a national spokesperson for the society. He actually is he's long since dead, but he's an inspiration for neo-Nazis today. And he once, for example, baselessly charged that Israel was exporting LSD to the college campuses and was the source of all the chaos on campus. Another Birch chapter leader told groups that I think he was trying to recruit people to the society. He was giving a speech in which he was arguing, or he had this conspiracy theory in which he said that the bones found at the Buchenwald concentration camp were not Jewish. They were not Jewish people. They were actually the bones of U.S. Army soldiers killed by the Russians. And the FBI actually was interested in finding out more about this guy. A guy named James Oviatt, who was a prominent and very wealthy member of the Birch Society. He's actually the most prominent haberdasher in Los Angeles. He distributed thousands of copies of a booklet modeled after the Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion. And actually, when I told because I grew up in LA, when I told one of my good friends about Oviatt's name, I think, is still on a very famous Art Deco building in downtown LA. And so my friend said, well, I'm going to start a movement to get the name taken off, which I thought was interesting. More than mainstream conservatives, Birchers also trafficked in conspiracy theories. So fluoride in the water, right? This is one of the most famous, right? Yeah. I actually had someone who I was doing a talk in San Diego, and someone said, yeah, I remember in high school, a teacher who was a member of the society warned us, don't drink the water. Like, don't drink the tap water, right? And as we were talking about earlier, it's not because they were in Flint, Michigan, right? It was because they thought it was poison. So fluoride in the water, one Bircher document warned, was, quote, a massive wedge for socialized medicine. Or, quote, the peculiar cancer that killed former Senator Bob Taft may have been, Robert Welch, the founder, wrote, quote, induced by a radium tube planted in the upholstery of his Senate seat, as has been so widely rumored. Okay, which, if you think about it, first of all, what I tried to do is, just as an aside, I try not to go too deep into the rabbit hole of these theories, because, how is someone going to get onto the Senate floor and put a radium tube inside the leather upholstery of, so anyway, I tried not to go there. Finally, Birchers defined freedom on their own terms. It was not access to the ballot box for all, nor was it freedom to act in accord with one's own precepts, and it certainly was not Franklin Roosevelt's freedom from want. Their conception of the republic demanded the dismantling of the welfare state and often dreamed of imposing their own version of Christian values on American schools and culture. So how did their beliefs inform their actions? The society enabled members to fight the communist threat in the United States, and therefore was, quote, the answer to every anti-communist prayer, as one member said. And I think that was one of the things that appealed to people. They felt like it was an action-oriented group. It enabled and empowered them to take action against what they perceived to be this internal menace in their communities. Grassroots women Birchers powered much of the movement and moved with speed in the early 60s to make their presence felt. So they formed a variety of front groups, such as Impeach Earl Warren, right, which you probably remember or have seen. Support Your Local Police was another. Birchers distributed flyers calling President John F. Kennedy a traitor, erected billboards smearing Martin Luther King as a communist and pasted stickers on envelopes. We're a republic, not a democracy. A phrase that has had, I think, something, at least a bit of a comeback in the past decade, where, like Senator from Utah, Mike Lee, I think, was tweeting positively about this idea. The rank and file ran for seats on local school boards, promoted bans on supposedly communist teachings like sex education, and opened and operated bookstores and libraries. Now, Birchers, of course, and I probably don't need to tell you this, you probably don't know, but at the time they were widely regarded as unhinged, right? Welch's most notorious theory that Dwight Eisenhower was a dedicated agent of the communist conspiracy, right, became notorious. It really became a touchstone for synonymous with the idea of the paranoid style, right? The sort of crackpot approach. That was popular critique of the Birchers at the time. But I also argue that they brought underappreciated innovations to far-right politics. And here again, I think Steve Bannon probably responded to this argument. So while Welch and other leaders promoted baseless conspiracy theories as fact, Birchers also understood how allegations of a plot against the United States rallied activists in opposition to a common foe and motivated citizens to get active in the struggle for power. Birchers showed future generations of far-right activists how mass mobilization around single issues could reap dividends far beyond the issue at hand. The society also helped forge a coalition of super wealthy industrialists and upwardly mobile professionals, with some white working class conservatives and evangelicals. So I think you see the makings in the society of a primarily white Christian cross-class alliance. And I think the Birchers demonstrated how the far right in the 60s appealed to a subset of voters and activists in every region of the country, indicating early on a level of cross-sectional popular support for the far right. Because one of the things that most struck me that I did not anticipate was that I assumed, as had been so widely kind of thought and reported, that the Birchers, their activity was really concentrated in the Sun Belt, places like Phoenix and Arizona, Phoenix, Arizona, and Orange County. Birchers were all over the place in the Northeast. They were very energetic in the Midwest. They were in the South, the Mountain West. It really was very much a national phenomenon. The group exploded onto the scene in 1961 when the news media reported that Welch had established a secret anti-communist organization and that he had once tarred Ike as a communist agent. And critics, because I also pay attention to the critics, many critics considered the society both a twisted joke to be mocked and a serious threat to the nation's fledgling multiracial democracy. So Harry Truman, at the time an ex-president, of course, called Birchers, quote, the sick among us. Liberal leader, civil rights activist as well, Joe Rao, fretted that Birchers were, quote, bent on destroying the very structure of democratic society. They were called little old ladies in tennis shoes, pathetic, and most enduringly, paranoid. Birchers made a few inroads into politics. They elected some of their favored candidates. They won a few legislative elections. And really, most famously, they helped Barry Goldwater prevail in the 1964 presidential nomination. But what I also argue is that over time, the attacks from a coalition of Cold War liberals took a toll on the movement. And so I devote a chapter in the book to the Anti-Defamation League's extensive counterintelligence operation to infiltrate the society. And we can talk a little bit more about this, but just to kind of give you a sense of what the ADL was doing. And the ADL was not alone in doing this, but in a way, I argue that it was one of the most effective organizations at discrediting the Birch Society in the public eye. So the ADL had actual operatives with code names like boss number 4, boss number 6. They would be sent out on missions to infiltrate chapters, even infiltrate headquarters. It was run by a guy named Isidore Zach, who I'd never heard of before I started research. And Zach was actually a highly decorated Army veteran doing counter-subversive operations for the Army during World War II in the Northeast. So he was trying to ferret out, fascists and communists and other perceived subversives. So the ADL did things like they ran credit checks on Birchers. They obtained a codicil to a Bircher's will, recorded license plate numbers in places of employment. And then they would basically compile this dirt, and they would feed the most unflattering bits to the press. And they would use this information to expose the Birchers as enemies of democracy. And also they would do that in their own publications as well, their books and articles. So I think that was one kind of external pressure that was bearing down on the society. But beyond those external pressures, the society had its share of internal woes. And I argue that as well, even though the group still exists as an organization, right? It's still got, who knows, few hundred, few thousand members. But really its heyday, by the early to mid 1970s, it really was a shadow of its old self. And one of the things I also argue is that it kind of imploded from within. So it had money woes, personality conflicts, and its conspiracy theories, I think, attracted more and more radicals, many prone to violence and bigotry to the ranks. Its membership declined. And again, by the early 70s, it essentially, as a movement, it had become an epithet and shriveled. And we can talk more about that too. But then what I also argue, and I'm not going to get, I'm going to wrap up in a sec, but just to give you a sense of what I try to argue in the book is that I think a funny thing kind of happened, which is that Birch ideas lived on. A variety of successors who were inspired by the Birchers' example, but more sophisticated in their politics, picked up on the Birch legacy. These Birch descendants developed the project and kept the society's ideas alive through the decades. So the gist of the argument is that during campaigns, especially, conservative leaders would woo the far-right elements, these far-right successors, but that also the fringe would grow frustrated with these mainstream electorally successful conservatives once they took power, because they governed in a way, these conservatives governed in a way that frustrated the far-right on many of their core concerns. I also argue that the world changed in many ways, and I go through some of them, not in great depth, but the end of the Cold War, for example, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and many other factors at play. And I don't have time for them, although again we can certainly talk about them. But I just want to end by saying, with just a last story, which is that in 2012, as you'll remember, after Obama defeated Romney, the GOP famously conducted an autopsy, trying to assess its mistakes and recommend reforms. The report ultimately urged Republicans to embrace immigration reform, woo Latinos, Asian Americans, and women, and adjust to the increasingly diverse American electorate by enlarging the party's tent. And in a way, the report was an attempt by institutionalists to take back power from the radicals. And the changes, of course, were never adopted. Another path beckoned. 3 years later, Donald Trump announced his presidential candidacy with a meandering speech in the lobby of Trump Tower, condemning Mexican immigrants as rapists and criminals. And commentators, as you'll also recall, derided him as clownish. His ideas were so beyond the bounds of acceptable discourse that few voters were going to tolerate them. Pundits and politicians from both parties agreed, right, including many Republicans. But in retrospect, I think this is something that I think flowed organically out of my research, and one of the things I argued, that one of the things that we as a country missed was that Trump was an exponent of ideas that had simmered on the far right for decades. Right? Observers who sneered at Trump's chances lost sight of what some liberal leaders in the 1960s had come to see as a painful facet of modern America. Liberals back then knew that capitalism and democracy had almost collapsed during the Great Depression and the crisis of fascism. They grasped a truism that many Americans missed amid the glow of Barack Obama's landmark presidency. They have forgotten a liberalism of fear, or what the political scientist Ira Katznelson described as, quote, a kind of persistent anxiety that sometimes things can get worse. Birchers bestowed to subsequent generations a fraught legacy, a politics of the street, where armed militias, QAnon adherents, white supremacists, and their leaders lived in the spirit of what Abraham Lincoln once warned against. In 1838, concerned that mob violence imperiled the nation's fledgling democratic institutions, Lincoln predicted that the gravest danger to democracy was never going to originate overseas, but, quote, must spring up amongst us. If destruction be our lot, we must ourselves be its author and finisher. And with that, I'm happy to take questions, talk about any aspect of the book or any other issue. Thank you.
I have the microphone and I won't keep it. I'm sure we'll deliver it wherever you say. You pick someone.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Well, why don't we start over here on the left and we'll move down
And perhaps people will identify themselves.
Okay.
That
Sure.
would-
You're on my left, so you're definitely on the left.
Hi, I'm Amy Schustheim. I was a little surprised that you put Eisenhower and Reagan in the same breath as mainstream conservatives, Republicans, because to me, Reagan personified the undoing of the New Deal that we have never recovered for. As social workers, we were told to count curtains in a house as a luxury item when we dallied up families' wealth. The other question, and like a good Jew, I have two questions, is what was the relationship between McCarthyism and the John Birchite Society? Because McCarthy destroyed quite a few people's lives. And it took a long time to get rid of him. Thank you.
Yeah, so those are both good questions. On the first one, I don't mean to suggest that Eisenhower and Reagan were super like-minded or very much simpatico in their politics, or, I mean, other than they're Republicans. But the point I was trying to make is that we can see at least the history or the evolution of conservatism as having these more electorally successful figures running from Eisenhower to Reagan, which is kind of one spectrum. And then on a dividing line where you also have these far right, more extremist figures, as opposed to, say, lumping Reagan together with the Birchers. Because one of the things I try to argue in the book is that people like Nixon, Reagan, Bob Dole, you can go on the George H.W. Bush, George W. Bush, the Birchers and their ilk or their successors, they didn't like any of them for the most part. I mean, in the 1980s, when Reagan sort of did a 180 and embraced arms control, the remnants of the Birchers were protesting him, thought that he sold out, right? He's part of this conspiracy. Nixon, they loathed. They never liked Nixon. They thought that, he was basically a traitor to their cause. And so I was trying to capture, I guess, some of the anger and animosity and the critique from the far right of these more mainstream, because even when someone like Reagan went to Bob Jones University, the segregationist university in South Carolina, and would during a campaign make a sop, right, to maybe white supremacists or other extremists. A lot of times he was more pragmatic when he got into office. And that's not to diminish the power of any of his policies, right, in terms of rolling back at least aspects of the welfare state. But it is to kind of try to capture those divisions. On McCarthyism, which is another very good question. So look, Joe McCarthy, in many ways was a hero to many of the Birchers. And they really flowed out of the defeat or the kind of sidelining, the censoring of McCarthy in 1954. And then Robert Taft, who was another hero, the Ohio senator, a Republican, when he lost the nomination, Republican nomination in 1952 to Dwight Eisenhower, Robert Welch called it the dirtiest deal in American political history, because Taft was seen as someone else that they could rally behind. And so to many, at least of the Birch founders, they viewed, I mean, it's complicated because some of them were actually Republicans, some of them actually supported Eisenhower, interestingly, but for the most part, they viewed the Republican Party as being part of this a slow-rolling communist movement, that the Republicans were, essentially expanding the welfare state and putting people like Earl Warren on the court, and they had destroyed McCarthy and Taft, and so that was also a reason why they wanted to be secret, because they worried that what happened to McCarthy, as the example, right, of what not to, you wanted to guard yourself. And they wanted to protect themselves from allowing, in their words, the communists to get wind of them. Because if the communists found out about the Birchers, they would destroy the Birch Society just like they did McCarthy. And so, McCarthy was an object lesson for them. And arguably the Birchers, very different positions, but had more success potentially, or certainly endured for a longer period of time. Yeah.
Barbara Green. Two questions also. One, who is John Birch? All I get
Yes.
from Google is that he was a missionary and
Yeah.
died in China, but I
Mhm.
know nothing more.
Yeah.
Secondly, where did the phrase, the great replacement theory, come from? I never heard of it till Charlottesville,
Mm.
but obviously
Yeah.
it didn't start there. Is
Yeah.
that a Birch legacy?
Yeah. So again, those are a really good question. So John Birch was a missionary, an evangelical turned Army intelligence officer, and he served in China at the end of World War II. And there's actually an entire biography written about John Birch that came out a number of years ago. And John Birch had absolutely nothing to do with the John Birch Society, because he was killed by Mao's communist forces 10 days after the end of the war. And it's sort of a long, convoluted story, but Robert Welch, the founder of the Birch Society in the 50s, worked with a senator from California named Bill Nolan. And Welch ultimately wrote a short biography about John Birch. And the argument was that not only did the Chinese communists kill this American Christian, God-fearing soldier in this, horrific way, but that the U.S. government had covered up this crime, right? That the U.S. government, and this is, of course, another echo of McCarthyism, because the book emerged, I think the book was published maybe in 54, or maybe it was 56, in the mid-50s. And so the conspiracy, right, that the idea that the government was a traitor to the United States was with him. And so Welch, with the support of, after writing this biography of Birch, with the support of John Birch's parents, who were from Georgia, named the society after him. And so, the Birch Society was very shrewd in that they had a number of martyrs. John Birch was one, McCarthy was another, Bob Taft, right? Someone had actually caused the cancer that killed him. And there were many others as well. And so I think to Welch and many others, right, Birch was an inspiration, right? Someone who had died at the hands of this conspiracy. on the great replacement theory, that's a good question. Some people in the audience probably know exactly where. I think part of its origins emerge from French, maybe white supremacist novel in the 1970s. I don't know exactly where the great replacement theory, like the origins of it in our own times, come from. But I guess what I will say is that I think that, Trump's, the far right for decades really has had a kind of anti-immigrant bent, right? A kind of view of immigrants, especially from this coming over the southern border, overrunning the United States. I think, Trump did in around 2015 pull together a lot of these threads and bring it into the mainstream. And that, even if he had never heard of the great replacement theory in 2015, the outlines, right, the picture that he painted, and that the wall, build the wall, right, the 2016 mantra that it symbolized, I think it echoes, right, with this. It kind of brought it into the mainstream in a way that it had not been. And but of course, these nativist ideas that immigrants, especially immigrants of color, are ruining the United States, or, as Trump recently put it, right, they're poisoning the blood, right? So, these have origins going back centuries, right? And in a way, I think the country, in some ways, over the past 6, 7, 8 years or decade, has almost reverted back more to its pre-1940s, more nativist and kind of isolated. That's not to say those ideas ever died, but that it has sort of made a comeback in a way that I think most of us didn't expect.
Cheryl has a question from our Zoom audience.
I'm over here.
Oh.
Okay, this is from Betsy Broder. Wait, hold on. Who asked, do you see a thread with Newt Gingrich, who might not have been a true believer, but cynically exploited the Birch types to gain a majority?
Yeah, Gingrich is a really interesting figure. He was a little hard for me to kind of know where to put. I mean, I think he did have an understanding of how to weaponize the legislative process, how to weaponize the cameras, the C-SPAN cameras, how to use the rules of the House to and create a kind of, and also use ethics, right, and scandals, and also had a vision of, I think that, even though some of his tactics maybe resemble Birchers, I think he was far more politically sophisticated in a sense. And that's what gave him his power. That's what, enabled him to envision that it was possible for the Republicans to take the majority in the House for the first time in 4 decades. And he had a vision that he delivered on. And, if you go back and you read the contract with America, there are certain kind of cultural hot button issues that do echo, I think, some of the Birch language or the Birch ideas. But, Gingrich, I think, was a slightly more capacious and maybe, more really politically more of a tactician and far more successful, I think. Yeah. Your words. Yes. Yes. Yeah.
My name is Andy Narva. I'm just wondering, is the Birch Society just one of a continuum of organizations that date from our founding that advanced white Christian nationalism, or is there something special about Birch Society?
I think that there were, so by white Christian nationalism, you mean this vision that the United States is fundamentally a white Christian nation and that our laws should reflect that, right? It's an interesting question. I think that there are elements of the Birch Society that do speak to, that did resonate with people who believed that in imposing, again, their version of Christian morality on, because the Birchers were very active in school boards and in PTAs and in textbooks, all of the kind of, Moms for Liberty cultural issues that we read about today. The Birchers very much were active in that space. They were trying to take over these groups, and they believed that a kind of godless sort of communistic teaching was depriving their students and their children of the sort of Christian moral education that they deserved. And so, as one critic at the time said, they wanted to bring the country back, the Birchers did, to the McGuffey reader era, right? So there definitely is, and there are other ways, I think, too, in which the sort of, and look, on civil rights as well, the civil rights movement, one of the things I argue is that the Birch Society, even though they claimed they weren't racist, they had a conspiracy theory about Martin Luther King, of course, and the civil rights movement, which was, it was a plot directed by the Kremlin. And, I think that that's a racist theory, right? The idea that, an African-American struggle for justice cannot be organic to the United States, right? That it's this foreign directed plot. So I think it was that, but I think it was also other things as well. And in a way, one of its strengths was that it meant different things to different members. And so some members were very much drawn to these kind of Christian cultural issues, cultural morality issues. But, others really were much more interested in, U.S. foreign policy, right? And kind of getting the U.S. out of the United Nations, right? And so it was, in that sense, more capacious than kind of just a white Christian. But there were elements of that, I think, absolutely. And some of the people who were in the society who then moved on to other pastures, because the society was like a gateway. It sort of radicalized some people, and then they wanted a more extremist group. So to the Birchers, you're not anti-Semitic enough. You're not. So, Willis Carto, who became the leading Holocaust denier in the late 20th century, he had been a Bircher at one point. People who were active in the militias, the white militia movement, the Minutemen. Robert Depew, one of the founders, he had been a Bircher at one point. And so, some of them thought the Birchers were just too tame. Charles Lindbergh? Yeah, I didn't find any references to Lindbergh in my research, although some of them, of course, at least Robert Welch and others, were at least adjacent to or connected with the America First movement in the 30s. Yeah, back here.
Barbara Diskin, what group today would you say it would be most closely aligned with the John Birch Society?
Yeah, that's interesting. Well, the Birchers do still exist. And they were actually, they were at CPAC, the Conservative Political Action Conference, a few months ago. And a reporter asked me, well, what do you think that says? Like, why would they be admitted to CPAC? And I said, well, of course they'd be admitted. Like, they're the moderates in the room. So when Bannon held up the book, he was actually interviewing the co-founder of Moms for Liberty. And the context was that there was an article in The Guardian in which they were, looking at, well, the Birch Society and Moms for Liberty. Is this, is there a resonance there? And I argued that there are obviously real differences, including that I think Moms for Liberty is a more powerful it's become much more mainstream. And the ideas have actually become in law in a way that they did not in the 1960s. And Tina Deskovich, I think is her name, one of the co-founders, she, Bannon said, hey, they're calling you Birchers now, girl. Like, what do you say to that? And she said, well, it's a ridiculous claim, of course, we're not Birchers. Do we share some of their ideas and view of the Constitution? Of course we do. I think Moms for Liberty, though, as a woman-powered, sort of with a Christian view of a particularly Christian view of morality, and imposing it on the culture, on the schools, I think that is a real echo. I do think, I'm trying to think of other groups that are really active. Some of these well-funded groups that are funded by dark money, right? That you don't even know like their names. I'm not even. Well, Fred Koch was one of the founders. So, something like Americans for Prosperity, I think that there is some overlap. This kind of extreme free market, more extreme, far more extreme, by the way, than I think what Ronald Reagan did in terms of their vision. I think that there are elements of that, right? And the Koch, and actually one of the Fred Koch's sons was a member, a leader of the Birch Society for a while. But the Birchers had a lot of very well-funded, big donors who were giving to them. I guess maybe because I'm steeped in the research, and you try not to, of course, there are more differences probably than similarities between then and now. But I do see echoes in many of the elements, and certainly in this America First part of MAGA. It's not quite a group, but I certainly see that as an echo. And, the idea of a deep state, right? I mean, is very much, I think, even though the Cold War is long since over, the Birchers had their own deep state that they were warring against. And they didn't call it that, but they had a similar, I think, view of government and of and the kinds of abasements it was capable of. Oh, yeah. 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 That's well, that's pretty head scratching.
Question.
Oh, yeah. Sorry. It's such a good question, right? So how did the far right come to embrace, Vladimir Putin's Russia, right? Putin. So at the time, this is maybe a difference in some respects. So the Birchers they did not have a positive view of Russia, but they did like a number of authoritarians around the world. So they did have a special place in their heart for, say, South Africa's apartheid regime. I think was it Sigmund Rhee, the authoritarian ruler of South Korea, Chiang Kai-shek, right? The sort of more authoritarian anti-communist, as they saw it. And did they like Hitler? So I did not see a lot of explicit references to Hitler, but I did find a couple of examples in which the ADL reported, for example, in one of these operations, that a couple of Birchers were having a conversation, I think at a chapter meeting, and they were complaining that the television news never let Hitler rest in peace. Just leave him alone already. So, again, you don't want to attribute too much. And there were like members and chapter meetings where this more explicit kind of white supremacist, really kind of a neo-Nazi element filtered into the meeting. And the ADL uncovered this stuff as well. And occasionally Birch members would write in to complain about it, saying, hey, we have these Jew haters in our chapter who are taking over the chapter, and they're writing into headquarters saying, what are we going to do about it? Right. And so you do see the society itself at times trying to police its own ranks. In terms of, so I think that there is an attachment of sorts to remember, they were not very supportive of multiracial democracy or one person, one vote. And this also gets back to this idea of, who has the right to govern and right to rule? Well, I think in many ways, a sort of Christian white men. primarily. So I think that's one element. And the thing with Putin, I think, is much, I don't know, I don't recall pre-2016 a lot of far right hosannas, we're going, I mean, I just don't recall this as part of the conversation on the far right. And I think that, in a way, because Trump and this MAGA movement sees Putin as really one of the leaders of the anti-liberal movement, right? The movement against the FBI, the CIA, this deep state, the rule of law in many ways. I think that, and also as people like Trump saw Hillary Clinton, Mitt Romney, who in 2012 in that debate said the greatest geopolitical threat is Vladimir Putin. I think that, again, not to put it all on Trump, but I think that, he saw this establishment, as he calls it, opposing a really strong authoritarian leader that was able to kind of take on the cultural left, right? And do the kinds of things that, Trump aspires to do. And so I think that it's, on the one hand, MAGA and Trump and people who support him, they'll say, well, these communists and Marxists, right, are marching and there aren't many communists left anymore, right? And yet, of course, Vladimir Putin, arguably coming out of the KGB, right, the old Soviet system, it's sort of one of these ironies, but I do think it's that attachment to this illiberal strongman which does have, I guess, some echoes, although it's, I think, a real departure. Oh, one more or no? Are we done? Sorry.
Oh, thank you. So two questions. One, how did you become interested in this topic? You didn't talk about that. I'd be interested in that.
Mhm.
And then I was interested when you mentioned about the Ku Klux Klan and the Birchers, that they kind of didn't see eye to eye. And I wondered more about that. Was it the anti-Semitism?
Well, yeah. So that letter written by a Birch member in Mississippi, I think what she was saying is that, hey, we're trying to recruit more Birchers, but the KKK is like our toughest competition down here. And so, and yet, the Birch Society would often, in the cartoons of the time, they would be lumped in together with Gerald L.K. Smith, right, a notorious anti-Semite white supremacist, the KKK. And the Birch Society was very sensitive to that. And they spent a lot of energy trying to say, we're not the KKK. And, and there is something to that. They're not the KKK. And there are other even more violent groups on the far right. And they were not quite that as well. So I guess I'd say they're on a continuum or maybe a spectrum. And that, if I were going to draw it up, there are some groups, including the KKK, that are really far right, that like expressly promote violence, believe in violence, and very explicitly promote a white supremacy, right, as an order. And then there's, groups like the Birch Society, right, which is slightly more to the left, which sounds a little crazy, I know. And they do dabble and they embrace, right, some of it, but they are much less explicit about it at times. And yet there was crossover, and there certainly were, I found a bunch of evidence of, members of the KKK in Massachusetts or some other white supremacist group writing to the Birch Society headquarters saying, hey, you and us, we agree. We're like the same. Come join our movement, right? Like let's partner. So, and there were other, notorious anti-Semites who funded the Birchers. So there was a lot of cross-pollination. And then in terms of my interest in the project, look, like a lot of historians who, so I wrote my first book about Ronald Reagan actually in California in the 60s. So I was interested in the rise of conservatism. And then, of course, like a lot of historians, Trump wins office and people are like, well, where does this come from? And part of the debate is, well, was this conservatism all along, right? Was Trump really this was like the apotheosis, right? So I was interested in that question. And I think come out in a different place, which is, again, as I argued, the far right had its own tradition and that it was quite distinct from these more mainstream, pragmatic, people on the far right, they hated George W. Bush. Trump in many ways ran against George W. Bush in 2016. And so, around that time and I'm interested in the 60s as well. And so I thought, and there was also, the last thing I'll say is there was a surge around the time of the Tea Party. There was a mini surge of articles about the Birch Society and comparing it to the Tea Party. And there had never really been, I think, a good, well-researched book about the movement, the Birch movement. And so it kind of, came together. Thank you.